שלום, ברוכים הבאים. I'm Yishai Yafe. I'm the new, I can't get used to this. I'm the new dean of the business school. Let me start by, you didn't come here to listen to me, but also let me start by making, 3 short comments. But before that, Danny usually, shares his experience as dean with me. I'm not sure how often it happens that you have to welcome a person, a Nobel Prize winning economist. I think it's something that probably happens only, certainly, once in an academic lifetime or something. So I'm honored to have this opportunity. Professor Scholes' work will be introduced later by Danny. I just want to say 3 short things. I think Professor Myron Scholes is, of course, famous for his academic work, but perhaps unlike some other Nobel Prize winning economists, his work is special in that it has influenced both academic research or academic theories as well as practical or real-world practices of financial management. So that's one interesting angle that might be special or unique to this occasion. The second thing is, as you probably know, Professor Scholes has spent his life not only in academia, but has been involved both in option pricing theory as well as in some non-academic endeavors. And so his views of finance or economics and finance are especially interesting. And perhaps the last thing to say on this occasion is the timing, right? So we have been, I guess, depending how you count, 3 or 4 years into a financial crisis. Some observers regard the current crisis as a disciplinary crisis of finance and economics. So others think that the villains behind the current crisis are sophisticated financial products that Professor Scholes is indirectly related to. And even the general notion that the financial crisis erupted or started in the most sophisticated financial system, something that we're used to thinking of as the most efficient or closer to the models that we teach. And nevertheless, this is where the current crisis started and seems to be going on for quite a while. So I think all of these things make this occasion and this talk especially interesting. And I would like to invite Professor Dan Galai, another expert on options, to introduce Professor Scholes.
Thank you very much. It's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Myron Scholes tonight to our students, alumni, faculty members, guests, premier guests. For many, the term Blek-Shults is like a brand name, such as General Motors, Coca-Cola, or even better, Ford, Hewlett-Packard. You use a name, but you have no identity or no idea about the person behind the name. So today you have an opportunity to know Myron Scholes and to know who is behind the Blek-Shults formula that many of you, as I know, use it some on daily basis, some on weekly, monthly, etc. I met Myron 40 years ago when I was a young PhD student at the University of Chicago, and Myron was a young faculty member, actually returning to his alma mater to Chicago after 3 years, I guess, I believe, at MIT. 5 years already at MIT. If I'm not mistaken, Fisher Black just arrived in Chicago a few months earlier with no academic experience, actually. He came from consulting. For me, it was fantastic coincidence. Let me explain in a few words. I started to work on options actually in the summer of '71, not knowing about Bleg-Shultz, not knowing much about options. By coincidence, I saw a PhD dissertation by Zweig. It attracted my attention, and I worked during the summer with Jack Gould, who later on was the dean of the business school at the University of Chicago. There was no course on options, obviously, at the time. Options were not even mentioned in any financial course. All the introductory courses by Farmer and Miller, there was no word about options. If you look at textbooks from the 60s, early 70s, even late 70s, there's hardly any mentioning of options. Late 70s, yes, but up to the middle 70s, very little. Working on the subject, I realized that the CBO is starting sort of is in initiation, in preparation, waiting for the green light from the regulators. At the same time, I realized that Professor Jim Lorry was on the board of the Chicago Board of Trade. Professor Merton Miller, from the M&M fame, he was writing a report for the CBOE, on behalf of the CBOE, on the effect on small stocks, penny stocks. Because the idea was that maybe by introducing options, the penny stocks will die out because they will replace them. So he was writing a report, very interesting report at that time. Professor Larry Fisher, another professor at the University of Chicago, was somewhat involved in options by being the chairman of the dissertation committee of Bones, who wrote a dissertation on pricing options 10 years earlier at the University of Chicago. And now, here came the two new age scientists, Black and Schultz, representing something that is quite different, continuous time approach. You know, until the time, everything was discrete time. If you look at the KPA, Markowitz, everything was discrete time. And then it was sort of a change, a switch in how we think about it. It was really exciting times. I still have Myron's class notes in my office. I can even find it, believe it or not. Another anecdote from those times, in 1974, I was almost finishing writing my dissertation, and both Myron and Fisher were on my dissertation committee. I came to Fisher Black and discussing some issues, and he told me, Danny, let me tell you something. Myron and myself, we solved everything that has to be done on options. We have the theory, we did empirical study. Why don't you switch and do something else? The only remaining issue is how to estimate volatility. And he was very serious about it, and you know, Fisher Black and his ideas, and but you know, he was partially right in observing that the major issue is estimation of volatility. So maybe we'll hear more about it today. And that was all in '74, that everything's solved. Another anecdote related to the Hebrew University is Professor Marshall Sarnat, one of the founders of the business school. He came in '72, '73, he came to the University of Chicago. I had already, I was sent by the Hebrew University. I was expected to come back. And I told him that I prepared to do some work on options. And I told him, Marshall, believe me, options will be the most important topic in finance, both trading, academic, practically also in corporate finance. And Marshall said, you Chicago guys, you always think that whatever you do is the most important. It's like stable proration, distribution, all kinds of things that are sort of trendy, and you try to sell it to the whole world. I don't buy it. So I used to mention to Marshall again and again over the years. Undoubtedly, the Bleg-Shultz was a major breakthrough with great impact on financial markets, financial theory, both in trading, instruments, investments, and also in corporate finance. and on practical work that we'll hear more today. I think it's on par with the M&M proposition, KPM, and Markowitz. It changed the world, the theory as well as the practice. Therefore, it's not surprising that Myron combined also in his career the academic work, being at MIT, Chicago, Stanford, with practical work, LTCM, hedge funds, and before Salmon Brothers. I think that was the beginning of the practical work. Also, Fisher Black, by the way, was with Goldman Sachs. Initially, he was working as a consultant, and then Goldman Sachs. So 40 years passed. By the way, the papers, they had some difficulties to be accepted for publication. So the publication date is June, if I'm not mistaken, in the Journal Political Economy, 73. Yep, May. So June, July was a Bell Journal? Yeah. The Merton paper. So it's a great opportunity today to have Professor Myron Scholes, to hear his views on the model, how it's being applied or misapplied, on the potential for the next 40 years, maybe some words about how it's related or unrelated to some of the crises. So I think it's a great opportunity, and I welcome Myron Scholes to present his talk. Thank you very much.
Well, after that, any questions? Yeah, thank you very much for the kind introductions. Actually, I had, and reflections back and everything that was said. What I'd like to do today is talk for a while, give a talk and talk for a while, and then I'm sure you have myriad questions, and so I'd love to be able to attempt to answer those as well. One thing that I might look a little strange because I don't have my left eyeglass, I only have my right eyeglass, and that was because of I didn't have optionality. I didn't bring a second pair of glasses with me, and my glasses broke here yesterday on the left side, so I only had this right side, which I'm fine at this moment. Maybe it's my rightist attitude to life. In addition, I'm sorry I'm not giving the lecture today in Hebrew. Unfortunately, when I was a young person, I skipped grades when I was in lower school, and my Hebrew teachers thought that I should skip grades in Hebrew class, which was bad because it ended up being Peter's principle that I got to the point where I was too far behind everyone else in the class. I think that in terms of Danny and at the University of Chicago, he did have the vision, unlike a lot of others at the time, to really think about how options would have a role to play, and he too had become very interested in the intersection between the academic world and the applied world, and so had delved very definitely into trying to understand how an initial market worked. And that was the birth of the Chicago Board Option Exchange, and how pricing worked initially in that exchange, and how long it took for the market to become efficient. And he had the smarts and the brains to realize this was a phenomenal laboratory in terms of just delving into something that was so new, and to see how and whether the markets were to become efficient. And it's interesting, and just a reflection of that time before I jump in here, is that at the time there were two groups of traders. One is the MBA students who had the Black-Scholes model and had sheets of paper on which would give the model prices for the inputs they provided, and also give a way for them to hedge the risks that they had in the contracts that they were trading. And that was one group of people had never traded before came out of the business schools and had not any trading experience. So one thing, we had the theorist on one side, and then you had the grizzly old traders on the other side. So these persons had traded over-the-counter options and presumably had lots of experience in trading. And so they didn't want to use any models or academic thinking at all in applications and how they traded. And so you had one group versus the other group, and I don't know, maybe within 6 months to 9 months, the young Turks who had the models and the pricing and the technology actually disappeared from the floor and were taken over more by the academics, who were a little bit too academic in the sense that people didn't think about crashes and possible dislocations in the market until after 1987, when the market tended to crash, and then they changed the way in which they incorporated jump processes. In giving this, I was thinking, I'm working on some other academic papers, but I thought of this, giving this in part because it's good for me as well. I was, since it is 40 years, the International Financial Review has asked myself and Bob Merton to actually write a review of options and where we think it's going. So these are sort of some preliminary ideas I have, and on this, so I'll use this as a sounding board. Moreover, MIT, where I had taught for the first 5 years of my professional career before Chicago asked me to come back, gave a seminar. The faculty of the finance group taught the faculty of MIT, other than in economics or business school, about finance, and gave 75 professors who had no understanding at all of finance and why it was valuable and the like, what finance was about. And I gave, they asked me to come back and give one of the talks in the option section, introduce the option section of the 4 days that they gave the talks. The reason that they gave the course was that so many persons around, from not only from the press, but academics and practitioners, obviously had doubts about what was being done in finance and what we think about and how we think about issues because of the crash that occurred in, or the financial crisis of 2008 or 7 and 8, and how it, and its evolution, still winding its way, if it is related to what's happening as well in Europe. But one of the amazing things that I've learned over the years in talking to people is the way we think about problems in finance, the way we think about problems in economics, and how we think about how markets work and how individuals work is still so crucial in how I always applied things to when I was a practitioner, in addition to being an academic. And so we can try to understand so much more about the crisis and its evolution and what the implications are, and how we're going to change our teaching and how our research will change going forward. So I'm, even though I had most of my work in finance always involved the idea that we observe prices. We observed prices and market prices, and we observed distributions, etc. And then we could use theory to understand and to those distributions. And also now we know more, and it became so over time, that we are involved in the markets. So it's not just looking at the markets, but being involved in the markets and how the decision making or the needs of enterprises such as financial institutions and intermediaries generally affect markets and affect market prices. And that's one of the reasons that attracted me to aside to become, go into the practitioner world initially with Salomon Brothers, simply because I used to teach the courses at the business school, like develop courses, and then when the young professors came in, they said, what could I teach? And I said, okay, here's my courses. I got my notes. You can use them, and you can teach the option courses or other courses. And then I would try to develop more courses and continue to do that. The only course that I always had a great deal of difficulty in developing or discussing was intermediation or financial institutions and how and what role they were playing and how that was going to evolve. And so that's what led me to say, I don't understand this, and therefore I want to get into it and see what it's like by being on the inside and doing it that way. So I then, my first month or so at Salomon Brothers, they took me to lunch with various of their clients, and they gave me a problem that their clients were working on, and the client was with us, and I said, my gosh, that's such a tough question. I mean, you know, it'd take me months, if ever, I could work out the answer to that particular question or that particular issue. So I said, and then after about the 6th or 7th lunch, I decided the reason they took me to lunch was because they couldn't solve the problem. And you know, it's like the winner's curse. I was cursed to be able to get those problems that were so tough that there was not really an answer. And really they wanted to then tell their client, if he couldn't do it, you know, we can't do it either, buy this product, you know. So that's what we have. So what I'd like to do today is talk a little bit about the option pricing and its applicability, and so what I'd like to do is to talk about really things that are not talked about a little bit in terms of how we developed the model and how we thought about the model and the differences between Fisher Black and myself and Robert Merton's approach to it, and questions that arise because of the differences that we have in our thinking and how people have, in my view, have used the model and the technology in different ways. And then to talk a little bit about, and then talk about afterwards sort of things that I think about in terms of what we have to learn and how optionality or uncertainty becomes such a crucial part of all our lives and will continue to be such, and we have to really develop ways to address it. One of the interesting things that we have in finance that's so crucial is that uncertainty is our most important thing. What we do is we take uncertainty as our primary focus. How do we deal in an uncertain world, and how do we try to address problems under uncertainty? A lot of economics and a lot of other parts of like macroeconomics or microeconomics really are certainty models with error terms on them, and therefore taking expectations or not, then the error terms tend to disappear. So I think in terms of macro and lots of other issues, then optionality or finance is going to play a much more crucial role, because one of the things that is missing from macro, if you think about your macroeconomics and thinking about those issues, is credit. You know, credit is not really part of macro. You know, why is it the credit is available? Why is credit not available at times? And how does credit priced in the marketplace? And again, this relates to the intermediation functions that I was talking about previously. So let me go into this in a little bit and delve into it. In '97, as was mentioned, that we were awarded the, Robert Merton and myself were awarded the Nobel Prize in economics for a method to value derivatives. And unfortunately, Fisher Black, who would have been obviously awarded the Nobel Prize as well, had died in 1995. So it was a method really to value derivatives and not for the Black-Scholes option pricing model. So, and there's a difference between the technology that we developed and actually the model itself, and I'll get to that in a second. Really, the option is a right, but not an obligation. It's the ability to exercise that right that has value, and it's as a result of that right is, has a non-linear payoff to it. And prior to the Black-Scholes model, there was one or two ways in which things were priced, and everything was done in an arbitrary way in separate papers by actually Eyre, Sprinkle, Baumel, Maciel, Quant, Samuelson, Baness, and Chen, that you had to make some assumption to price this right to buy something. Then people either use the expected value of the distribution, the final distribution, partial expectation, and then they discounted it back to present value at some arbitrary rate. There's nothing in finance theory or economic theory that would suggest anyone would look at the expectation, the partial expectation of the final payoffs that you would get 5 years from now or 2 years from now, and to price the distribution of returns and to discount that back. There was no theory that would suggest that that's how those assets would be priced, because we need models that everything has to be priced together. It's just, you can't look at this one asset and abstraction from every other asset. That has to relate to bonds and stock and other options and other commitments and other things to make it be an equilibrium or a whole. And so that was very arbitrary. And when you read books or papers that say, you know, they have that the Black-Scholes model or the Merton, Black-Scholes-Merton technology was in prior papers, such as in 1900 or in, you know, Pillar the Elder, or maybe even Herod and something had been working on it when he was building the temple here in Jerusalem, and had an option pricing model. But I think the big difference between all these models were they're arbitrary. They just were arbitrarily stated, and until the Black-Scholes technology was developed, and then Merton's technology that followed, there was really no consistent equilibrium view of how to value an option, which is completely different from any other model that was historically done or stated. Now, Merton and Samuelson wrote a paper that had scared Fisher Black and myself, and in the spirit of competitiveness, since we were both at MIT, that we kept our work completely separate from Merton or Samuelson, because we wanted to get as far along as we could before we revealed it, because academics is a vicious place. It's dog eat dog, you know. One of the things that I was asked when I went to Salomon Brothers, what was the difference between academics and the business world, such as Salomon Brothers? And I said, at Salomon Brothers, it's dog eat dog, and at the business schools and the academic profession, it's exactly the opposite. And so, but Merton and Samuelson had developed a model which didn't have to discount the expected terminal value, the partial expectation, and that was a step forward, but they still used an arbitrary discount rate to bring it back to the present. So the discount rate that we needed to discount all assets in the economy, as I said, stocks, bonds, options, in some equilibrium framework. And I went back. You know, I have the first version of our paper was October 1970, and I have that version. There's no one else now has that version. You have a version October? Oh my gosh. Well, I just appreciated my version quite dramatically. So the first version was October 1970. And what we had done in the version was, in the Bak-Scholes version in 1970, was set up a dynamic hedging strategy which used arbitrage, okay, between an option and the underlying capital asset on which the option was to be written. So you had the basic thing as the stock, let's say it's a stock as the underlying asset, and the option on that particular stock. And what we had combined was the idea of arbitrage together with, at that time, the capital asset pricing model, which described the relation between all assets in the economy, how they had to be priced. And we liked that. It was an equilibrium model that we believed held over a very short period of time. Because only over a very short period of time could we assume the returns on assets, a very small period of time, were normally distributed. Once you get out of that short period of time, then everything changes because things evolve. We later on, people later on assume that the parameters were constant, but you know, if a stock goes up or an asset goes up, it has to fit into the mosaic of all other assets. And those other assets, in combination with the asset you're trying to value, have to be priced together. So the market changes, the value of the asset changes. In theory, there's nothing that would say the expected return or the volatility of an asset would have to remain constant over time. In one period, you can assume that things over a very short period of time are normally distributed. They're not going to go very far, and that was the genesis, that's the basis of the capital asset pricing model. Though at the time, and maybe even today, people always think of pricing as monthly data or annual data or whatever. And so we thought of it that it would really only work over a very short period of time. And what we said was that, and that was a crucial assumption. But the interesting part, so we took that as assumption. One is we wanted to think of arbitrage, but then at the same time, we also thought an equilibrium that the capital asset pricing model would apply, and I'll explain how they come together in a moment, to development of our technology. So what we did was say, okay, how does arbitrage work? We said for a small change in the stock, delta X, okay, in the price of the stock, when the current price of the stock is X itself, so X delta X, and that the current time is T, the change in the price of the option, which will designate WX of T. So we said the option value had to be a function of the stock price and time. That was obvious because this is a nonlinear payoff. You know, the idea that if the option becomes way in the money, it's going to look more like the stock. If the option is way out of the money, it's not going to look as much like the stock, and it's levered. So we had to do it in a very short period of time. And what we did was we looked at the change and said the change in the option, W1 X of T, is the change in the option with respect to the first argument, X. And how is that? And we said that the option price is going to change by approximately that derivative times the change in the stock price itself. And so in the arbitrage position, we balanced each option against this amount of stock, W1 XT of stock, so that what would happen would be, we'd think that what would happen as this position that we had, it's not a position of a stock, a certain amount of stock balanced against the option. How would that position change over time? And what we found is because once we took the Taylor series expansion of Wx of t with respect to x and t, that we found the only term left that had any uncertainty at all in it was a term, this 1/2 of the second derivative of the change in the option with respect to the change in the stock price and time, and the square of the stock price. So the square, in a very short period of time, the square of the stock price is actually equal to the volatility squared times the stock price squared itself. So the most important point for us in the way we thought about the problem was what happened to this delta x squared? What happened to this volatility? And if something is normally distributed over a very short period of time, then it was the case that the volatility is unrelated to the expected return or unrelated to the mean. And since the capital asset pricing model related the expected return to the market in equilibrium, then basically it would be uncorrelated. So that the changes, how the square of the stock price changes would be unrelated to what the market did. So you can think of it as being, if the market goes up, the square could be positive, obviously, and the market goes down, the square would still be positive, and you can show mathematically that they're unrelated. So we thought that basically if we could take a combination of options, even if over a short period of time, that even if there was some association, not necessarily some correlation or causality, that we can diversify them away. We can diversify all risk away. Therefore, the expected return on this hedge position that we had, this position of long the option, short the stock in a particular way, that position had to earn the riskless rate because that was equilibrium in the market. It had to be priced that way. And so we ended up with a basic differential equation, and with, as described here, that the change in the option value with respect to the change in time, and it would be equal to the risk-free rate times the option value times et cetera, plus this volatility term. So the only thing that was with the boundary conditions specified below at expiration T star. So the only thing that in equilibrium that was necessary to value the option was some estimate of the riskless rate and some estimate of volatility. Okay. Now, the reason I'm giving this again, some of you have probably glossed over it because you talked about different ways to value longer term options, that notice here that there's nothing which says in this relation that the volatility has to remain constant or the riskless rate has to remain constant, okay, or that assets have to be priced in any particular way. So what has happened subsequent to this is that for valuation purposes, we made in a paper the assumption that the riskless rate was constant, okay, and we made the assumption that the volatility was constant, but that's an assumption, okay, and that has to be represented by the data. So if you think about the option pricing model, which is the Blag-Scholes model, that was built on this idea of a constant interest rate and constant volatility. But there's nothing in the technology, and we were awarded the Nobel Prize, it was for the technology, not for the Blag-Scholes option pricing model, which tend to be married together in people's minds. But basically, obviously, if the volatility is changing, and you know the volatility each period, you have to value the option, dynamics is to be able to know each period what the volatility is, which makes it a much harder problem. But the basic idea of whether it's the capital asset pricing model or some factor model, this is all internally consistent with an equilibrium valuation. And so that was something that I just wanted to bring up as being different from there. In fact, even in the original paper, we had started to work on what happens when interest rates change. Later on, people have built on the model, talked about interest rates changing and the covariances and the structures you need between interest rates as a hedging mechanism and also the underlying risk of the underlying asset. And also stochastic volatility has been introduced into the modeling. But at the time, Fisher and I said, well, you know, the fruit, there's a lot of fruit on the tree and it's all low hanging. You know, why do we wait to solve all these other problems later on, even though I didn't realize that Fisher said everything was finished at the time when he talked to Danny. And a lot of people, after we started talking about our paper in seminars, then also started to do work. Now, in 1971, in the summer, I presented our paper at a Wells Fargo conference, and we're going to introduce it for the first time. Like Merton Miller was there, and Gene Fama, and Bob Merton was supposed to be there, but he overslept, so he didn't hear the presentation of the paper, but someone gave him a copy of our paper, and then he came into my office and said, "You're wrong. You know, what you developed is not right. You can't assume that there's not this correlation between the volatility as I specified and the underlying asset." And I said, well, I don't believe you're correct, because you know I've done my statistics and the mathematics, and I think I'm correct. So we argued as good colleagues would for several days, and finally I said to him, you know, well, why don't you try the case in which it's perfectly correlated, you know, between the stock and the option, just to make it clear to you that that's correct. Let's take that as a numeraire. And then he proved that that was the case, and I remember him phoning me up and saying that he agreed with us. It's wonderful to have colleagues who are going to beat you up and make you worried, but at the same time realizing that that was the case, that you were correct as well. So what he did, Bob derived, which is a completely different methodology actually, because he derived the partial differential equation, the same equation that I had put up on the board before. But he assumed that Ito calculus and Ito limits, Ito's lemma, and with continuous trading, you know, we always liked it, Fisher and I always liked the discrete trading things. We didn't think of people trading continuously, you know, and we used one short period of time to think about trading, and Bob went to continuous trading, and he applied the hedging portfolio, and really showed that when the resultant portfolio that we constructed, the arbitrage portfolio, really had a zero variance if you can let time get very small. So continuous time get very small. All the risk was eliminated because the change in the price of the option would be perfectly correlated with change in the price of the underlying asset. So no capital asset pricing model was needed. This is a pure arbitrage model. You didn't need any model of equilibrium. But what bothered Fisher and I, and still does to this day for me, and I don't know about Fisher but at this moment, but basically the idea that the change in the, his model assumes that really both the change in the rate of return and the variance of an asset are instantaneously uncorrelated with price changes. So basically, we liked it because we can't assume over finite periods of time in an equilibrium context, if you're doing the theoretical part, that basically we can describe things as being log normal. It doesn't aggregate correctly. And so we know there's changes in volatility that occur and expected returns occur, as I said earlier. So there's a difference between the two models and the two ways of approaching things. And from the pure mathematical point of view, and assuming that the distributions have constant parameters and will preserve it, you'll get the Merton model. And we use that technology to get actually the Bak-Scholes equation. So I think that, but from all of this, in terms of developing the model and that, it really says it's not perfect in the sense that to apply it empirically, you have to make assumptions, or you have to know how volatility changes. You have to, as Fisher said, and to Danny, you have to understand really the evolution of volatility and how that's going to change. What processes are you sampling from? You know, if there's why, and if there are jumps, why do jumps occur from an economic point of view, and how are jumps priced in total in the marketplace, and not just on how they're priced in the option world. So, but from all this technology and the idea of the option pricing modeling, we can learn so much that others do not know about, obviously, what options are and how important they are, And we know how to approximately value options on myriad different contracts and myriad different activities. And these options that are embedded everywhere in our society tend to be ignored, okay, and tend to be because people assume that the options either don't value them or can't value them or don't want to value them or don't consider them in what they tend to be doing. In a lot of ways, over time, from the development of our models, the technology, that what we saw was nothing really. In other words, when you look back at the application for many years, you always look back when things are changing exponentially and everything looks linear. You know, everything in our world is really changing exponentially, but we observe things and we look at the data, and the data look as though it's linear, but yet at the same time there's this huge exponential growth that's happening underneath it. And so the application started off to be what appeared to be very slow. And to trade options first on the Chicago Board Option Exchange and then on to other exchanges. And it took until around the 1980s before intermediaries such as the Goldman Sachses or Salomon Brothers and other banks, Deutsche Bank, etc., were starting to use options in construction of alternatives for their clients. Because what finance tends to do in all its functions of finance, the functions of finance, everything from transacting to risk transfer to financing large-scale projects to deciding on how to save for the future, how to think about reducing information asymmetries. Everything finance tries to do is compress time. All the functions try to compress time, make things faster, and two is make them more idiosyncratic. Instead of having stock and bonds, that's a big category. Finance and business too is try to make money by making things more suitable to what the client wants. And to do it more to what the client wants, that means you can't just have a schmoozing business, where you have bonds and stock and you look for buyers and sellers of big things. What has happened over time is to fashion idiosyncratic solutions and fast solutions for clients. It was necessary and is necessary even today for the intermediary to take positions on their own account and then hedge risk or transfer risks that to be able to reinsure their activity, just as the farmer sells their crop to the miller, and the miller hedges risk by transferring it to the speculator. And so the form of transferring risk and hedging risk and developing idiosyncratic products is really an important function of finance to suit the needs of you and me and other corporations and other banks and other intermediators in society. So doing it, if you sit around and you try to transact for months and years, like taking, for example, a simple thing. You have, I know you're here all associated, as all of us are in Silicon Valley, with venture capital or high tech. If you want to save the money to undertake your business, it takes a very long time to do that. So without having businesses arise which are private equity firms or venture capital firms or getting a lot of friends to help you, you're going to have to keep your money in your pocket for a very long time before you can take your idea and move it forward. So compressing time is important, making it idiosyncratic to your needs is important, and the third is flexibility. What we see in development of all businesses is making things more flexible, making it such you can change your mind, change what you do, the option to change or become flexible in how you undertake your activity. What is the value of that flexibility? I mean, the most flexible thing you can be in the world is an architect. You want to build your apartment or your home, you just have some ideas, you go to the architect, that's flexibility, the most flexible. But flexibility has a cost. If you sit around for 20 years trying to design that home you want, you're not going to have a home. And so it's expensive to keep things that way. So I think that the idea of flexibility is optionality that compressing time, increasing more idiosyncratic ways of doing things, and really trying to understand how to value optionality is part of what we do in finance. But the interesting part about finance is that sometimes it stops, that sometimes the ability to compress time is not there. Like it shocks, time's a shock. And I want to discuss that in a moment or two, but at times of shock, it's not there. Time stops. So instead of compressing time, everything expands. Instead of compressing, things become idiosyncratic, disappear, because no one's available to do it at that time, to design these things and do it because of the uncertainty about the parameterization of the process. And also the idea is the cost of optionality goes sky high at that time, or the cost of flexibility. So that basically when we think about finance, the natural progression is to compress time, but at times of shock, time expands. Instead of compressing, all the functions that we think about in finance get stopped at a crisis, and then have to figure out how to get them restarted again. You know, and that's, we have to build theories of that to understand why that process breaks down and therefore creates the crisis. One, you can say that crises occur or shocks occur. You can say that, but why? You know, what's the underlying driving mechanisms that cause that to occur is we have to now start research on thinking about that, as opposed, you can say they're exogenous, they'll occur. But you know, we want to understand why they occur. So if we look, for example, before I get into that, I want a digression for a second and talk about 3 fallacies of credit that are now prevalent everywhere in the world and have been here forever. So you can think of these 3 fallacies of credit have existed in the 1900s, they existed in 1920s, the 30s, they exist today. And they exist everywhere today. And the 3 fallacies of credit, and why I talk about credit, because I'm talking about lenders. We always think about borrowers, but it's the creditors make mistakes or don't think about things as well in terms of fallacy, especially when we think about governments. And I'm going to be talking about governments here because people in government are not using their money. They're using our money. And there's a huge difference in the way they tend to think about things. So the first fallacy of credit, I think, is, and it relates to options, is that for every solution to a debt problem is to provide more credit. So you provide a means to move the mountain of debt that exists by providing more credit. For example, if Germany provides more credit to Greece or to Portugal, Ireland, Spain, Italy, or the IMF does it, or the European Central Bank does it indirectly, or Germany has to do it, or China to the US and Europe, then this provides a means to move the mountain of debt provided by credit forward in time, and so that means that they'll be able to work their way out of these difficulties and be able to pay you back. Well, without valuing the optionality or looking at the option in a realistic way and saying, how far out of the money is this option? What's the probability the debt will ever be paid back? If you look historically, the debt has been most often than not renegotiated, you know, in some way or other that the debt is not paid off. And that, so just by saying, it's like, you know, you have your children or whatever, I have my kids, Dad, give me more money just give me more money for my projects, it'll be fine, and etc. So the second is the view that people are entitled to a better life. And basically the idea there is that you have to extend credit because of entitlements. In other words, if it's the case that Greek citizens or the like are going to have to lose their guaranteed employment or their Social Security pensions or their pension benefits, that they earn that, even though all these promises that were made to them were made on a promise, not funded. And so those people in the United States, the same thing we have now, where it's the case we promise Social Security benefits and we at the same time have Medicare and other types of health benefits. where basically everyone thinks that they've contributed fully to the program, therefore it's reserved and available. But the problem is that it's not only in terms of the idea of Western governments deciding on providing more credit to continue these entitlements with the idea that basically it'll give them time, they'll be able to work, we'll work our way out of these problems, and we'll be able to pay off on the debts and be able to fund these programs. And more debt, more credit, until the system then collapses and it's not possible to do. So we have to value. It's one thing to say we want to extend credit because people are going to get better off. It's another thing to say what's the possibility or the value of what we are giving. If you give someone a shekel and it's worth only a tenth of the shekel once you give it to them, then the probability gets lower and lower that you're going to be paid off. And the third one is really a fascinating fallacy that I have found in looking at the literature over time and looking at today's world. The idea is that the propensity is to claim that the product of credit is prosperity. In other words, if you give credit, you have prosperity. And the way we think about things in our finance and economics is the reverse. You know, we think that, okay, speeding up time and that if you lend someone money on good projects or good value, they're positive present value, you may increase the wealth. You know, by lending the money, you'll get paid back. What's the value? So you might not, but you can value that option and see whether you get paid back or not. And it seems nowadays that the reverse is true, that what we have to do is we have to provide credit to actually enhance international trade. So if Germany lends money to the periphery of Europe, and the periphery then has the money to buy German goods, Germany's better off. Why? Because their exporters are exporting more, the people are getting more services from Germany, and everyone's better off. Okay, so China's doing the same thing to Europe and the United States and lending us money on credit. They're shipping us goods and services. Well, this has happened, if you read history and look back at history, this has happened period after period. You always hear we have to keep our exports, Germany has to keep its exports up. That's true. But what if you come to me, or I come to you and I say, why don't you lend me money and I'm going to consume anything you can give me. I'll buy with what you give me, the money you give me, and I'll buy your goods from you and I'll consume them and I'll be happy with that. And by the way, when you come to get your money back from me, there ain't any. You know, I'm broke. So what was the value of stimulating exports if it's the case that no one's going to pay you back? So, and if you keep giving more money to them because you say, otherwise they'll never pay me back, then you have to think they're going to be able to grow themselves out of the problem to be able to give you the money back. So we can use our technology to really value these. Once you think about it this way and ask these questions from uncertainty perspective, not from the certainty world, because the certainty thing is that, yeah, they're going to pay us back, or the promises we gave for entitlements, we're going to be able to fund them for sure, etc. But the question is, obviously the opposite is also not true. So I think, and one other thing too is that, you know, in terms of Germany, I know when I'm in China and the like, that Germany's exporting a lot of technology to China, you know, and one of the things we have also for us in the United States is we have our children. And we have all the entitlements I have in the United States. You know, I'm an old guy now. And all these entitlements that I have, you know, my medicine, my everything, all my medical care, my Social Security and that, which I didn't pay into enough money to fund, that means our children are giving us credit. So we're having the idea that they're going to have to pay off on all this credit they're providing us to enable us to continue to have these services. And just to show you in the United States case and why it's such a big problem that we have to address is that we have a $15 trillion economy right now in the United States. And the government expenditures for years tended to be financed by about 18% by taxes of their, and 2% by borrowing. And actually, if the GDP of the economy, the real productivity growth of the economy, is going up by 2% a year in real terms, then the debt is not really increasing, you know, this percentage of our GDP. And even though I don't like GDP, because growth is determined in societies by GDP. But that's not a good measure of what we want. It's an easy measure, but it's like assuming that you're getting paid a dividend on a stock, and you don't care whether the stock is going down or not, you know, even though you're getting this dividend. So GDP is, if you tell me to run the country and increase the GDP or growth of the country, I could do that very easily. Building roads to nowhere, or bridges, or infrastructure projects, etc., that are generating a lot of GDP, growth in GDP, but are destroying the wealth of our society. So again, the transfer, who's going to pay off on the debts of what we're doing today has to be the children tomorrow. So it has to be that we think about a way to define wealth enhancing as opposed to GDP enhancing, human capital and physical capital of our society. And I wouldn't care if the GDP fell, because we're wasting money. It's this option to come back, and that is always very expensive, if not, it tends to be very expensive and never valued. Yes, sir?
Today, what is the required growth on wealth in order for the U.S. to be able to pay back its debt?
That's a good question. I think that what it would have to be in terms of wealth is we would have to, I think that there's three things in the U.S. I think that are really crucial at the current time. It's a great question. Two things. I think the three things that I see are going to change the world in the next 10 years, okay, are one is the U.S. The U.S. is going to be independent with regard to energy production. Okay, we have huge amounts of shale gas that we developed in the U.S. that tend, somehow, I don't understand why, tend to be more difficult to produce outside of the U.S. We have tremendous water. I mean, one thing we have in the U.S. that China, which has greater shale deposits than we do, doesn't have is water. Once you lose water, you're in real trouble. Plus, a lot of our shale is in areas in which we don't have population. So it's, you know, it's great to be able to use that. While in China, which has great shale deposits, a lot of it tends to be in desert, you know, so it's hard to do. So water is a very scarce resource in a lot of places. So we're going to be somewhat energy independent. Now that doesn't mean the prices of will fall, because prices are set in the world market. But as Europe has difficulty with regard to oil and other forms of gas, etc., and obviously China, which is developing, has difficulties as well, in addition to having lots of other scarce resources. So the United States has tremendous amounts of resources, and energy is going to be much less expensive, which means that a lot of, that's one fact. Two is that the United States today, like Israel, is moving from an outsourcing model to an insourcing model. The idea was that we lost a lot of jobs over the 90s and 2000s, in particular, to outsource basic, inflexible technology and production. And so what we did was we lost the steel, we lost the cement, you know, for a while we lost the automobiles to Japan and other parts of the world. Now it's the case that with that outsourcing is gone and won't come back. But what we're seeing now is 5 phenomenal developments in technology in the United States. One is the development of microgrids in electricity. We can now harness solar, wind, and hydroelectric, you know, gas, coal, etc., into microgrids. We were losing so much energy because we had one shoe fits all, I said, one big non-energy grid. And now we're developing, and whole technology to be developed in the microgrid space. And that's going to be a big effect on the development in the United States, because they're going to make our energy costs even less and more efficient, and make the cost of producing goods and services in the United States much less. The second technology thing is, I think, is going to be a revolution, is the driverless car. It's amazing that Google can drive these cars around without having anyone in them. And you realize what that's going to do to the transportation and logistics of goods across the country. We're going to have caravans in numbers of years of trucks that are going to go through the United States without a driver. And then they're going to go off to the right or to the left, you know, and deliver things in a very efficient manner. And it's going to, and cars now, we can't get around our cities, and because of the whipsaw effect, you know, the driver in front waits to start. Why isn't that driver going? The driver in front. And so it creates these huge traffic jams, which can be eliminated entirely by having driverless cars that start synchronously and reduce the cost of that. So that's going to have profound effects on the cost of moving goods and services around the United States. The third in manufacturing, I think about, as an aside, is 3D technology. The idea of having it be that we can have idiosyncratic production of prototypes, and if we're going to have idiosyncratic production, that means we're going to move the production closer to the demander of that productive good. And so 3D technology is going to be phenomenal change. And I think probably here you're not going to like it, but I do think also distance learning, or the idea of having a whole new model of learning, is going to occur, which is going to change the competitive landscape. And the fourth one is automation. The last one is automation, robotics. I mean, it's amazing now the way robotics is changing production and making it less costly and flexible in the United States is very big in that. So with the growth in technology, the growth in energy businesses, the idea of more insourcing, and that as a second phase, those two things together are going to make it, the United States, very competitive, and will grow our way out of these things. And which combines in technology with our medical care costs rising so dramatically that there's a change between a personalized medicine, which is idiosyncratic again and more flexible, and how we're going to be able to be proactive in our medicine in addition to being just reactive, which is going to reduce costs. So those are areas in which I think I see the next 10 years, they're going to see huge growth in the United States in those areas. And you probably see those in your own country as well as being very important, and the like. So if we look here, our entitlements, I got the entitlements listed on that side. I'm sorry, another question? Oh, wait, let me finish a few things, then I'll come back. And so then I have here, you know, sort of, if you just do the naive projections, this is why I don't like naive projections. I took these from the IMF statistics and other statistics, but really it just says if we don't do anything, this is what happens as a fraction of GDP in the economy because of our budgets growing. We used to spend about, national debt as percentage of GDP is now 100% in the United States. And if you just look naively at the unfunded liabilities, we have huge liabilities for our medical program, $24 trillion. Our Social Security system has deficit credit problems again, as well as our debt, which is 9.7 trillion. We have a very bad accounting system in the United States. It'd be nice to change it so it'd be more realistic as to what our liabilities are as opposed to what they happen to be stated at. And over on the right, I haven't included here the $1 trillion or so in student loan programs that have provided students loans and affected our educational cost and the like. So, but in here, but also in the state and local areas also have huge deficit, as you read potentially in the Wall Street Journal or other journals about their pension liabilities and Medicare liabilities and medical liabilities. which have huge deficits as well. And the United States is obviously not only one country that is debtor country. I took this from the IMF, and it's probably really understated what the liabilities, the debt is, the general obligations of countries. And Japan is a very interesting experiment that we observed in my fallacies of credit, essentially just keep building things or lending money to increase, borrowing money to increase the infrastructure of the country and invest in projects which are not positive present value. So Japan has 200% debt to GDP, mostly internally held by an aging population, so we'll exactly see what happens to them and watch that occur. So if we look at how is debt to be reduced, okay, other than growing your way out of it, which I think the United States will, because of just the, as I had mentioned earlier, that we see now is an experiment in thinking about either austerity, which is trying to figure out ways to reduce wage rates, trying to figure out ways to reduce prices of rental rates to make, say, Greece more competitive with the rest of Europe and being able to export goods and services around the world. But it takes a tremendous amount of time for these adjustments to occur. And as we saw in France, that Mr. Sarkozy had fought to the death to increase the retirement age from 60 to 62 and ended up in a situation where Mr. Hollande, when came in, reversed it back to age 60 again, because of this idea of it being there and known. So the next one is sort of transfers. We know about transfers. And then the European Central Bank deciding on how much liquidity to provide to the system. So in what I'd like to do is to just do one thing more before, and my God, I've talked too long. I enjoy talking to you, I guess. Just want to do two things here going forward, but two things. One is optionality and thinking about flexibility. And the way I think about it, we have to value all of these, is that there's the, when you know something for certain, you build it in hardware. Okay, that's obviously the lowest cost solution. You have no uncertainty at all, nothing to worry about. When you have a uncertainty, or you need flexibility or optionality, then we take more the software solution. So we move more away from just having everything hardwired to more the software way of doing things. You know, you use your Excel spreadsheets or whatever if you want to become more flexible. But there's always been the trade-off between how flexible you make something, because it's more costly, and how solid you make it in terms of the hardware solution. And basically at other times, what we have is the mushware solution, you know, which is just our brains thinking about something, because at times of shock or at times of when we need a lot of change, then it's the case that it creates for us an ability to have optionality. And if we think about business and the development of business, everything that we've seen in technology is trying to move us more toward the away from the hardware solution to the software solution, to the ability to adjust and think fast. So that creating optionality, more and more flexibility in how we deal with things. So we have to think about how to value this flexibility. Like, for example, in Silicon Valley, to start up a new company used to cost $1 million in technology. You had to buy your servers and your computers. Now you've reduced $100,000 from $1 million because there's a cloud. You don't have to buy any of that equipment. You don't have to have an administrator. You don't have to have any of these things to do it. And so business makes money by moving in the direction down from the hardware to the more flexible solution. And that's all based on optionality. And one last point, which I'll try to do quickly, though it take me a little bit longer than I would like, is I've been working on the idea of trying to think about why time expands. What causes it to be the case that time expands? And I've been working on that, and also I've been working on what's wrong with Granger causality and the like. And basically, the way I think about things is that most business is run by some form of Ornstein-Uhlenbach process, where it's the case, this is a mean reverting type process. And we know we study basic economics, well, we assume the volatility is 0. That's the first thing we assume. So there's no sigma uncertainty and no random shocks to the system, the Z terms in the system. And so therefore, when we look at the process and the certainty world, then we say, well, lambda is the decay rate in profits. And I have the price of the good there times how much you produce, X, minus the cost of production. And so the cost of production, C of X, we say in the short run is fixed, but over the longer run, it's variable. And that's what we're taught. And I checked recent macro advanced economic textbooks, and the same thing, still there. Envelope theories, you know, and everything, but no uncertainty. So under the certainty world, you just say, my long run profit is pi bar, okay, and that I know competition's going to come in, and over time, my profits are going to devolve to pi bar. You know, I'm going to lose money each period at a slow rate, my change in my profits, d pi. But basically, it's some lambda decay factor. So if we assume things are a random walk, you're in competitive equilibrium, and basically lambda would be equal to 0, and you're just making sigma to z, or just random noise in the system if you include uncertainty. That's the competitive equilibrium model. Okay, so this is fine. So basically, we don't think that lambda is 0 or 1, that things go completely back to 0. So if you're in the intermediation business, like my business that I've been in and other times, then we assume some decay factor for our thing, maybe 0.2 or 0.3 or whatever, and competition's coming in to eliminate our profits. Now, interestingly enough, in everything we do in economics and finance, in our modeling, we assume a lambda and pi bar. We assume the decay rate and pi bar, and as a result of that assumption, we would pick a production function of C of X based on how uncertain we are. The more uncertain we are about production, the more flexible we want to make our production function. The more uncertain, the less uncertain we are, the more we want to make it less flexible. So the way we produce things, the goods and services, is based on how much optionality do we want. And that affects the C of X, or how we produce things. Now the interesting thing is we go along, and everything here is a change model, a change, assuming a decay rate of our profits and a location of our profits, a pi bar. At times of shock, or as we're getting closer to time when shocks are occurring in the system, we lose our ability to know what pi is, bar is, and we also lose our ability to know what is lambda, the decay rate. And if we lose that, then it's like the Heisenberg uncertainty principle of finance. Time stops. Right? Because as soon as we start looking at the location of something and we get rid of the velocity, finance and economics is velocity, change, turnover. You know, we're turning over, selling things, building things, doing things. And so we lose that. And so as soon as we lose the location, pi bar and lambda, then time stops. We don't know how to intermediate. So if you don't know how to intermediate, in a rational world, intermediaries would withdraw capital until they have the new location. Okay, so the way I tend to look at it is, the way I look at thinking now is that we have I call it the dog and the man problem. Okay, the man is walking the dogs, and the dog, and the man is paid by the dogs. Now, for those of you who are in behavioral economics or finance, you're the dogs, okay? So you're pulling the man away, and you're willing to pay for intermediation services, which essentially is all of economics. And so the dogs are pulling to the left and the right, and you're getting paid to keep them back on the path. So you're the rational person is the man. From time to time, the leash breaks, okay, which is liquidity in the system, and the dogs are scattering everywhere. And so when you look at them, the men are chasing the dogs. So the men look like the dogs, right? Because basically they're no longer the same. They are trying to relocate the dogs. And when they get the dogs back in the leash, and who has the competitive advantage to get the dogs back in the leash? Who has the economics to get the dogs back in the leash? They're the ones who can redirect the dogs and make profits sooner because they'll have a new lambda and a new pi bar. So those are teams of intermediaries who can come back into the system and restart the businesses again to start working with new locations and new activities. But notice, the path is not the same path. That nothing in economics suggests once you get the dogs back in the leash, you're not going to go back to the previous path. You're going to be on a new path. And so until that new path could be established, until new locations are found, then time stops. The markets collapse. The markets become more chaotic rationally because people are withdrawing capital. They can't intermediate unless they have fixed points, unless they have semi-fixed points of how to do business. And at that time, that takes time. So what we have to build into our theory and understanding is how much extra optionality we have, and how do we handle times in which we have these dislocations. And I think in a lot of ways, one of the things that I've thought about is the reason the crisis occurred in 2008 was people had the view that volatility was tame. You know, the lion was tame, great moderation. We had many more roots, derivatives, all the other things we had that were built over that time that tended to think that volatility was less. If volatility is less, we move away from flexibility. We go to hardware solution. We get more debt. We have less operational flexibility. We have the intermediaries taking more leverage, taking less operational flexibility, going more and more to the hardware solution. And so that's my premise. So now the future of thinking about this is, what do we do about this in terms of risk management systems? How do we learn to monitor this when it's the case that the system is becoming unstable, you know, in the sense that no longer is an evolutionary system, but it also has this idea that we could have these shocks and we need to change our location and our parameters. So I think I'll stop there, and because it's almost bedtime soon, and I'll answer any questions. People can leave if they want to leave, but if those who want to answer questions, I'd be glad to do it. Continue to do it. Go ahead. Oh, sorry, my glasses are bad, so you have to shout, okay? Or maybe I'll have someone recognize.
So, are the times that the time stops actually, are they not captured by diffusion jumps?
Yeah, but I'm trying to understand. I don't want just a process that's arbitrary. I'm trying to understand the underlying economics of the intermediation business. And when it's the case you're intermediating, all businesses are intermediating, they have to have some view of their decay rate of their profits and their location of where they're going. And so I think that's richer than just assuming a jump diffusion model. I could, but that means I'm not against that, but it's basically the idea. It's not, if we can get a more structure to the system and trying to understand what will affect their ability to intermediate, businesses' ability to intermediate, we might have a richer predictive model and a reactive model than one in which we just assume that we're going to get a jump from time to time. I could include in that model a jump, obviously, and have a jump process embedded on top of that. But I just wanted to leave it richer at the moment to see whether there's ways in which we can have underlying economics which would give us predictive tests and watch what's happening to the system, or understand what's happening in addition. Go ahead.
So when you mean it's mean reverting, is it mean reverting to the market portfolio, or did you just have any mean reverting to growth? What is it reverting to? What is our trajectory that we're reverting to?
Well, in terms of it depends what type of model you have or what type of how intermediaries tend to be working. You could have, this could be that you could have a production function of C of X where you're producing goods to deliver to P of X at some future time.
How do we measure it? I mean, the market portfolio, there is working towards it.
No, the market, well, okay, the question is that we have, if we go back to the financial world, leaving the production world generally, let go of the financial world, there are myriad clienteles that exist because of these dogs. You can have noise people, or you can have it behavioral finance people, you can have the dogs running all over the place, and they're causing flows to come into the marketplace that require intermediaries to step in and try to intermediate the imbalances that exist in the marketplace. And most of the intermediaries work on the theory of flows versus substitution, you know, and so either it's a relative pricing mechanism or an absolute pricing mechanism. But as Franco Modigliani said in his paper in the presidential address in the American Finance Association, he said that, and I agree with him, that the term structure of interest rates, which is an illustration, has clienteles in it. And each clientele has a natural habitat, and the idea of that natural habitat is an intermediary then will step into the shoes of the ultimate buyer in that habitat and hedge risk, just as the same thing as we know in the commodities market that the miller steps into the shoes of the farmer by taking the crop forward in time until such time as the baker buys the flour to make the wheat and cakes. So when you have people in the system, you have intermediaries who are intermediating flows or demands, and they are putting capital to work to do that. The only way they can make money is if there's people are willing to pay them for their services, and that's why I have a system here. They're getting paid. The farmer knows they're paying the miller to store the wheat. The bakers know they're paying the miller to hold the wheat in storage until they buy the flour. You know, and the customers know they're paying the bakers, know they're paying the miller, know they're paying the farmer for their intermediated services. It's just a more efficient way to do it than any other system at this juncture. So speculators are paid by hedgers, and those who want to transfer risk or hedge risk in the system are paid by those pay speculators. And the difference between this and a behavioral model is they know they're paying. They know they're giving up returns, which is different, okay, from the model that exists when they don't, and the behavioral model. So this is a rational model where I have my expertise or my specialization. So you could have many mutual funds or other investors who hug the index, or they keep their portfolios very tightly to the index, and then when new situations come up that they don't understand, then they would transfer the risk to others, knowing they're potentially giving up returns, but they don't have the expertise to do that. Or you have the private equity world is another intermediated world, for example, where the investments that are handled by private equity groups are completely different from the investments that we see in the stock market, because they have to have teams of people who can intermediate and understand this and bring together the capital with the corporations and their needs. Yes, go ahead. I'll get back there first.
Regarding your claim about the debt that is arising all the time, and the consequences of this, I want to ask you a question about this demonstration on Wall Street and all the things about it. I don't think that they are demonstrating against the system, against the debt.
Right. Correct.
But they don't do actually give the solution to that. What is your concept?
Well, the worry that I have, and I think it's affecting a lot of people, is that the jobs that they had are being replaced by machines. And we've always had in our society, is my view, the idea that you give a man a machine, the man becomes more productive. The man shares in some of that productivity gain. The capitalists share in the productivity gain. Prices fall. and society is wealthier, and the value of our capital goes up. And those who are displaced by the automation or the productivity enhancements, then because of the myriad combinations that we have in our society, are employed in other activities, etc., and we go on from there. So automation has always been based as a substitute, as a complement to labor. And we are in the stage now, first stage was outsourcing, and we outsourced so many jobs from the United States. Now the second wave is automation or robotics. And so when we insource now, we're going to insource but not employ the myriad people that we employed before. I think their angst is saying, where's my job? You know, what, in the sense that there's been a substitution effect in addition to the complementarity effect. And the substitution effect is what they're really worried about, that they don't see, because they didn't have flexibility in, they didn't go to Hebrew University and take myriad courses, so they had lots of flexibility as opposed to concentrating in one particular skill and getting high paid for that skill as long as they weren't automated or outsourced. And we know that high cost jobs and that can be automated are being automated because machines don't stop. You know, they have many hands and they can work 24 hours a day, and they don't need to eat lunch or gossip or go to the restroom. So this is, I think, the major problem that we have in our society, is to say, how are we going to have, what's the transition going to be like, and how we're going to handle that transition.
You don't think that we should be worried about the value of money that is decreasing all the time?
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that the one of the in the sense that you mean inflation, you mean, generally? I mean, inflation has been seen to be relatively muted, and at the current time in the United States, that the capacity of the economy is greater than, the output gap is still very large in our economy, and we could get shocks associated with the fact that the central banks around the world have a balance sheet now which is $16.5 trillion, and up from virtually nothing a number of years ago, representing about 33% of the value of the stock markets globally. So there's a huge amount of money that's printed, and a lot of money that's being printed to finance the debts. And so, you know, there's sort of what else you're going to hold theory with your money, you know, instead of putting it in your mattress or consuming apartment buildings. So, yes?
So, nowadays, after the crisis, each financial institution borrows at its own rate, which is usually very different from the risk-free rate. And for this reason, the prices of derivatives, of the same derivative for different financial institutions, would be different. So do you see certain convergence there, or certain adjustments whatsoever, or they will be, the spread will just increase?
Right. What happened was, in a lot of the contracts, there were derivative contracts that were over the counter. The horizon of the broker-dealer community went from being long horizon to short horizon. So as people wanted to eliminate their swap contracts or other contracts, then they priced them. They priced them away to make money in the short run. So it was very difficult to unwind contracts. So with the clearing corporation that is going to be put into place, that cost of unwind will go way down. Basically what happened in many cases is that the contracts, the derivative contracts, tend to be priced off of the LIBOR rates and the mid-market LIBOR rates. And so the receiver would receive LIBOR, but so they've moved now dramatically to try to use the federal funds rate or different rates. But we have a big question of what is the risk-free rate these days, and how we're going to measure that, and how that's going to be going forward. At the current time, people are saying, you know, how do we produce risk-free rates now? And we need a production function for more risk-free rates. The governments seem to be wanting to give up their jobs, such as the ECB and the Federal Reserve Bank and People's Bank of China, and obviously the Bank of Japan are printing so much money that we're not quite sure what the risk-free rate is anymore. Yes?
Regarding that last question, What is your opinion about the Dodd-Frank mechanism to moving away from idiosyncrasy into exchange-traded central
clearing corporation?
Yeah.
Yeah, I actually, when I built an entity at Solomon in 1991, 92, which was actually an entity that contracts terminated if Solomon would not put enough cash into the sub, the AAA sub, and it terminated at mid-market. And I tried to get other entities to join because I thought it'd be more efficient to have one market as opposed to Solomon having its own entity and other groups having their entities. And everyone was very afraid to come in because they're afraid that Solomon would have a peek into what they were doing and didn't want to join. But I thought that would be the most efficient, was having a central clearing and mid-market pricing. You know, right now, at the time of Lehman bankruptcy, they still had 1.5 million contracts that were not settled in the derivative world. And the reason being because at the time, that if you were a receiver, in other words, that a Lehman owed you money, then you put the contract to them and tried to get your money back. But if you happen to owe Lehman, you said, forget it, I'm not going to do it. So Lehman had capital at the time of their bankruptcy of something like $20–30 billion, and a number of weeks later, it was $60 billion in the hole. And here you have a broker-dealer, which is marking to market, its liabilities and assets. So the whipsaw that they had in trying to, once they went bankrupt and trying to hedge their book, because their match book became completely unmatched. So having a central clearing corporation reduces cost, in my view. And like when I was on the Chicago Mercantile Exchange board, and we decided on a model of having competitive floor versus having electronic. We did that, but everyone on the competitive floor said, if you're not listening to the outcry in the din of the market, you don't have enough information for your clients. And we all said that was nonsense, but everyone thought that they were, by hearing who was coming to the pit, they'd be able to have that extra advantage. So it's very tough to do. And so now I think with that, it's more efficient and it'll be less costly to handle derivatives that way. And I don't think there's that much proprietary information, because most of the contracts that will be cleared on the exchange itself will be standard contracts, such as swaps. So if you have your idiosyncratic contract, your one-off contract, they're not going to clear it. It's still going to be in your own book anyway under Dodd-Frank. It just means the number of contracts that will be idiosyncratic will fall. The more you try to regulate, you'll stifle innovation. You have to be very careful. Innovation is very dynamic and changing, but you can stifle innovation too. And unfortunately, there's a lot of war generals that are attracted to the financial industry. And as a result, it's, the ordnance people have to come back. You don't want to put, as you know, you don't put your ordnance people on the front line first. You have the war generals go first, not the ordnance. And now we have Dodd-Frank. My fear is there's too much ordnance in control and too much stifling of innovation, and the idea of being able to respond to situations. But as far as the clearing of derivatives go, I'm very much in favor of having the exchanges.
Last one.
Anyone? Okay, you get another one. Double here. The advantage is sitting in the front row.
Going back to this model that you presented, I didn't understand one thing. In your view, can you trade the risk away? Can you avoid the situation where you don't know what pi bar is, you don't know what that lambda is, because you bought flexibility in advance or insurance?
Yeah, but if you don't do anything. I mean, basically, then you got all the degrees of freedom in the world. But I think the idea, the way, okay, that's a whole new other lecture in terms of a discussion of how to plan for that. But it means you have to plan for it. So you have to have your debt, your leverage ratios have to be lower because of the inflexibility of adjusting debt. And two, it means you have to have more flexibility in your capital. So you need ways in which you create staying power. Because if you have a team in place, the value of your human capital will be lost if it's the case of a shock occurs and you have to unwind your business at that time. And if the opportunity set is changing and very dynamic in its opportunity set, you can make a lot of money if you plan for it. So the question you have the analogy I give is you can a lot of businesses work that they say, well, it looks like it could rain outside, but I won't carry the umbrella. So if you don't carry the umbrella and it rains, you get very wet. So but if you do carry the umbrella and it doesn't rain, then you have incurred a cost as well. So the natural tendency to increase profits is to make your production function, C of X, very close to the hardware solution, because then you make lots of profits. But if you need flexibility, okay, and you should have had C of X being more flexible, then you'll lose a lot of money. So if you understand this and think shocks will occur, then you design your production function or you design your capital, how you have your risk capital and your capital to be able to withstand shocks. Because the value of your, two things, because the opportunity set is not constant, okay, and two is because the cost of adjustment at the time of shocks is quite large, could be quite large. Okay? Thank you. Oh, a book.
Before adjourning, Myron was talking about driverless car, you know, cars without drivers. And we mentioned Mert Miller several times. When Mert Miller was in Jerusalem in '82, right, Chaim? I think it was the European, no, for the European Finance Association. I think it was '82, not the a conference. He said that in Jerusalem, you know, we say from Tzion Titzei Torah, he said that in Jerusalem he found a proof that the speed of sound is much faster than the speed of light. How come? It has to do with driving. He was driving a car. He rented a car and he was driving a car. He said he was standing next to a red light, traffic light, and he heard everybody's on the honking before the lights turned into green. So he said, I have a proof now. So on this happy note, I would like to thank Myron Scholes again. It was a great lecture, great talk, and we'll have more opportunities in the future. We shouldn't wait for 40 years for the next lessons. Thank you very much. See you in other meetings. Good night.